The overall problem in all of these additional functions that these users are used to is that it adds an amazing complexity to an already complex library catalog. So how do we control it? How do we work with it? The use of the ER model, the entity relationship model in FRBR and FRAD, does not get into all of the issues raised by internet search engines, social relationship issues, and recommender systems. This is not because they are not wanted, but because it has been a major effort simply to apply the ER model to the basics of cataloging. Wanted to talk a little bit about some research we could look towards. Excuse me. New areas of research that we ought to investigate more. How will getting a cataloger to think differently about a catalog, to see it as a relational database, how will that affect cataloging workflows, for example? Also, the 4 user tasks that FRBR outlines: identify, find, identify, select, and obtain. How are they supported? What does it mean to support a user task? These are questions that came out of a project that I did with my colleague Bill Moen called the MARC Content Designation Utilization Project, which we analyzed 56 million records in the OCLC WorldCat database. We literally took them apart, field and subfield, down to the very smallest subfield. We wanted to get an idea of how a cataloger utilizes MARC, how they support these tasks. And I think the one question we ended up with is, what does it mean to support a user task? We have to answer that first, I think. So RDA, what does RDA allow us to do? It's not a complete change in rules. In many ways, it is a reconfiguration of what we already do now. At the same time, it is both a broadening of the scope of what we catalog in terms of information resources. It would bring a more granular approach to providing access to these intellectual spaces. And by this, I mean how we might be able to manipulate data as it pertains to works, expressions, manifestations, and items. How would this change the infrastructure and allow, for example, more substantial clustering in catalog displays? In other words, the catalog, again, I don't feel it's going away, but rather how we deliberately construct and how users access the catalog is changing. I think there's also some very interesting opportunities for historical studies as it concerns development and the impact of RDA. This is kind of an area that I really like to look at. It's been very interesting to go back and look at some of the studies that went on when AACR2 was released in 1978. I think it's necessary simply from the standpoint of understanding where we've been in order to move forward. There are a couple of great books that I found that give us accounts of the impact of AACR2 in the late 1970s and early 80s. One is The Making of a Code, Issues Underlying AACR2, and another is Research Libraries and Their Implementation of AACR2, which has case studies in it on how they went about implementing. Very interesting things I found in there that I think that we could apply towards when, or if, I prefer to say when, we get to implementing RDA. The objectives and principles of RDA, just out of curiosity, did anyone take advantage of the open access period for looking at the RDA toolkit that ALA put out? If you look at the statement of objectives and principles, it says it serves to provide an overall guidance for the development of RDA, and that trade-offs are sometimes necessary to be made between one principle and the other. This is just a quick summary of the objectives and principles, being responsiveness to user needs, the data that should enable the user to accomplish the 4 user tasks, cost efficiency, the data should meet functional requirements, flexibility, the data should function independently of the format, medium, or system used to store or communicate the data. Continuity, the data should be amiable or amendable to integration in existing databases. It's not asking a whole lot, of course. How will these objectives and principles affect cataloging practice in terms of quality and quantity of cataloging production? I have one doctoral student right now who's looking at the perception of quality among catalogers in academic libraries, and is finding some very interesting things. The most important being there's no one definition of what quality is. So now we're bringing in a whole new group of objectives and principles. So I think that's another interesting research area. I don't know how much you guys have looked at or played around with RDA. I taught a course this past summer, a 5-week course, just an experimental course on how to catalog with RDA. And got into a lot of one of the first things that we see as far as a change is the choice of what type of record to create. In AACR2, it was based on format. We had chapters. If you were cataloging a book, you used a certain chapter. If you're cataloging a movie, you used another chapter. Well, this is shifted now to what type of description should the record represent. Is it going to be comprehensive, analytical, or hierarchical, which is a combination of comprehensive and analytical. So in other words, the variety of resource formats represented in a catalog is not in question. The question now centers more heavily on the scope of the representation. So by doing so, the catalog can more readily accommodate the interpretation or depiction of relationships between resources within this dynamic library environment. Another example of a different approach is the whole point of being able to show that in place of indicating access points as main access points or added access points, RDA speaks of authorized access points that are combinations of access points representing names and titles that, when combined, are authorized access points and that represent a work or an expression, which it took me a while just to kind of figure out how to write that. And we spent quite some time in the class discussing or trying to figure out or decipher RDA in terms of where it was sending us, because we were going from one chapter to another, jumping around. So RDA defines what constitutes an authorized access point representing work. For example, they say a preferred title for the work preceded by the authorized access point representing a person, family, or corporate body. So there are two elements, the title and the authorized access point of the name that are combined together. Excuse me, if we look at Chapter 6, identifying works and expressions, and in particular I looked at some rules in the 6.27 sequence. It's very important you look at the scope of the rules overall, Rule 6.0. The chapter also provides guidelines on using the preferred title of a work with other identifying attributes of a work and or expression to construct the authorized access point representing that work or expression, and using variant titles for the work to construct variant access points. In other words, we have to construct authorized access points that are representing works by combining elements. Furthermore, it really takes us out of the realm of using an encoding system like Mark 21 exclusively. So the whole point is not to focus so much exclusively on Mark. I don't know, often I ask my students, what do you think cataloging is? And they say, Mark. One of them one young lady responded the other day in class, because it's much easier to understand MARC than it is the cataloging rules. It's like, that's not what I'm trying to do. So we're going to see changes in MARC. We're already seeing some of that. And this is, I talked a lot about this this summer at ALA conference. We have some new fields, for example, 3 new fields, 336, 337, and 338, that will replace the GMD that is used in the 245. The GMD is going away. So there will be an increased need for authority control, and I have a slide with this flow chart for these MARC fields. But so what we're also seeing with RDA is an increased need for authority control. RDA puts a much greater emphasis on that than AACR2 ever did. And this means more continued investment in catalogers who are trained to provide this detailed work, as well as necessary changes in the systems themselves. I often go to libraries, or I talk to librarians or catalogers in the States that they don't do any kind of authority control. They don't even have an authority database for their system, or they're just doing copy cataloging and they're getting their records from a third party. There needs to be an investment in the training and continuing education for several years. Catalogers, and this is something that's very a big issue or debate among cataloging educators. When do we stop teaching AACR2 and when do we start teaching RDA? But for several years, we're going to have to teach both, because catalogers will have to know both sets, especially as the libraries make the transition. It will not be an overnight transition. AACR2 was released in 1978. Library of Congress didn't implement it until 1981. Although it might go a little quicker this time. But what I've heard is that, yes, it's going to be implemented, even though we're going to be testing it first. It will not be an overnight transition, and more catalogers will have to understand how things have been done and how things will be done. Library administrators and catalogers need to take advantage of the workshop opportunities, professional conferences such as this, and meetings in which training is offered. And again, I don't see the catalog going away. With RDA, we'll be able to build a stronger core for the catalog and provide the necessary stewardship of the data or of the knowledge. So this is just a quick flow chart. I don't know how well you can see it, that I used just to show how these 3 fields are replacing the one subfield that was in the 245 subfield H, the title field. And I don't know if you want me to go into detail on that, but it allows you to do a lot more coding. So it's more work for the cataloger, but it allows the system to sort resources better, and it gives more information. For example, media type, or if you need a special piece of equipment or an older piece of equipment, I threaten students often with microfilms or microfiche. And you have to have equipment to look at it, unless it's been scanned. But we can code this sort of information better in the records and allow users to know up front if they need this sort of equipment or just to view the material. So I think there needs to be more in-depth studies of bibliographic